It is September 2010. Somewhere in America, a customer walks into a Blockbuster video, returns a copy of The Dark Knight, and pays a late fee of $4.27. It is an utterly unremarkable transaction, the kind that has happened roughly 10 billion times since 1985. But this one is different. This particular late fee will never make it to Blockbuster's bottom line because Blockbuster is about to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the Southern District of New York, case number 1014997. In 3 days, the company that once operated 9094 stores across the United States employed 84,000 people and was so dominant that 1 in every 2 Americans lived within a 3-minute drive of its blue and yellow ticket stub sign, will officially admit it cannot pay its debts. The stock, which traded at nearly $30 a share in the summer of 2002, will be delisted from the New York Stock Exchange at 24 cents. The company's market capitalization, which had once exceeded $5 billion, will be effectively zero. And nobody, not the analysts, not the employees, not the customers, will be surprised. Because by September 2010, Blockbuster's collapse had become the most thoroughly telegraphed disaster in the history of American retail. Everyone saw it coming. Everyone except, apparently, the people running the company. How does a company go from being the undisputed king of an entire industry, an industry it essentially invented in its modern form, to a cautionary tale that business school professors will teach for generations? How does a company that generated $800 million a year in late fees alone that was once valued at $8, $4 billion when Viacom acquired it in 1994, manage to burn through billions of dollars in shareholder value and end up as a punchline on late-night television? How do you have a front-row seat to the biggest technological disruption in the history of entertainment, the shift from physical media to streaming, and not only fail to participate in it, but actively sabotage your own efforts to do so? The story of Blockbuster is not simply a story about Netflix winning. That is the short version, the version that fits in a tweet. The real story is far stranger, far more instructive, and far more human. It is a story of extraordinary vision followed by catastrophic blindness, of a founder who was pushed out, of a dealmaker who built an empire on franchising and then cashed out at the perfect moment, of a CEO who actually saw the future but couldn't convince his own board to let him chase it, of a corporate raider who demanded short-term profits at the expense of long-term survival, and of a replacement CEO who took what was left and drove it off a cliff. It is a story about what happens when a company becomes so addicted to a single revenue stream, those sweet, sweet late fees, that it cannot imagine a world without them, even as that world materializes all around it. By the end, one store will remain. One single Blockbuster in Bend, Oregon, kept alive not by corporate strategy but by nostalgia, by stubbornness, and by the fact that sometimes, in some places, people still want to walk into a video store on a Friday night and hold a physical case in their hands. This is the complete story of Blockbuster, the rise, the reign, the collapse, and the ghost that still flickers on a screen in a strip mall in Central Oregon. Before Blockbuster was a cultural institution, before its name became synonymous with Friday nights and microwave popcorn, before it was a verb, let's Blockbuster it, it was a piece of software. David Cook was not a video store guy. He was a database guy. Born in 1941, Cook had spent his career in the oil and gas industry, building sophisticated computer systems to manage complex inventory and distribution networks for petroleum equipment. He was the kind of person who looked at a messy, chaotic business and immediately saw the data structures that could organize it. He had never rented a movie in his life, not in any meaningful sense, when his wife Sandy brought home the idea that would change everything. It was 1984, and Sandy Cook had been running a small chain of video rental stores in Dallas called VideoWorks. The video rental business was, at that moment, chaotic and deeply unimpressive. Most stores were mom-and-pop operations, roughly 19,000 of them scattered across the United States, dark and slightly seedy, with adult films in the back room, and a selection of a few hundred to a couple thousand VHS tapes arranged in no particular order. The experience was wildly inconsistent. You might walk into a store to find that the new release you wanted was already rented, and the clerk had no idea when it would be back, because they were tracking inventory on 3x5 index cards, or, in the more sophisticated operations, in a spiral notebook. There was no way to know what was popular, what was sitting on shelves gathering dust, or where to send extra copies of Ghostbusters. During the week it was most in demand. David Cook looked at his wife's business and saw what any database engineer would see: a massive, screaming information management problem. Every store had the same problem. Every store owner was guessing. Nobody had any data. Cook's insight, the insight upon which an empire would be built, was that video rental was not really a retail business. It was a logistics business that happened to have a retail storefront. The key was inventory management, demand forecasting, and the efficient rotation of physical assets across a network of locations. He built a custom software system, running on a powerful IBM Series/1 minicomputer, the kind of machine used for serious industrial applications, that could track every single tape by barcode, predict demand for specific titles based on local demographics, and automatically route inventory between stores to maximize availability. The system could tell you, for any given store on any given Friday, exactly how many copies of Beverly Hills Cop you needed to have on the shelf to avoid turning away a single customer. This was, in 1985, essentially black magic. Nobody in the video rental business was thinking this way. Cook's software was the real product. The stores were just delivery mechanisms. He even filed a patent for his computerized inventory system, U.S. Patent Number 4787051, granted in November 1988, titled Video Cassette Rental System and Method, which described a network of computers communicating inventory data between stores. It was visionary. It was also expensive. Cook needed money to scale. On October 19, 1985, David Cook opened the first Blockbuster video store at 1200 West Airport Freeway in Dallas, Texas. The store was nothing like the dark, cramped video shops people were used to. It was 8,000 square feet of bright, well-lit retail space. The carpet was blue. The shelves were blue. The employees wore blue polo shirts and khakis. It looked like a Gap that sold movies. Most importantly, it carried 8,000 tapes, more than 10 times the selection of a typical mom-and-pop store. And every single one of those 8,000 tapes was tracked by Cook's software, which told him exactly what was renting, what wasn't, and where to send the next copy of Ghostbusters before anyone even asked for it. The store was an immediate success. Within a year, Cook had opened 3 more locations in the Dallas area, each one larger and more polished than the last. The revenue numbers were staggering by the standards of the industry. A single Blockbuster store was generating as much revenue as 5 typical video rental stores combined. But Cook had a problem. He was a software engineer, not a retail magnate. He did not understand franchising, real estate, or the kind of hyper-aggressive expansion that would be necessary to dominate a market before someone else copied his formula, and someone was always going to copy his formula. He needed capital. He needed scale. He needed, in short, someone who understood how to build an empire. That someone was about to walk through the door, and his name was Harry Wayne Huizenga. Harry Wayne Huizenga was already a legend in American business before he ever set foot in a video store. Born in 1937 in a Chicago suburb to Dutch immigrant parents, his grandfather had come to America from the Netherlands. Huizenga had dropped out of Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, after 3 semesters, and built a fortune in, of all things, garbage. Starting with a single garbage truck in Pompano Beach, Florida, in 1962, he had consolidated hundreds of small waste collection companies into Waste Management, Inc., which became the largest trash hauling operation in the world, generating over $1 billion in annual revenue by the early 1980s. His strategy was brutally simple and ruthlessly effective. Identify a fragmented industry dominated by small, inefficient operators, acquire as many of them as possible as quickly as possible, standardize operations, eliminate redundancies, centralize purchasing, and extract enormous efficiencies of scale. He called it rolling up an industry, and he was very, very good at it. By the time he left Waste Management in 1984, pushed out after a falling out with the board, he was worth an estimated $100 million and was looking for the next fragmented industry to conquer. In 1987, a mutual friend and former Waste Management colleague named John Melk introduced Huizenga to David Cook and suggested he take a look at Blockbuster. Cook's company was doing about $7 million in annual revenue from roughly a dozen stores and was seeking investors to fund national expansion. Huizenga visited a Blockbuster store in Dallas, and according to company lore, a story Huizenga himself told many times, he stood in the parking lot on a weekday afternoon watching customers stream in and out, each one renting 2 or 3 movies at a time, each one paying cash, each one becoming a member with a credit card on file. He did quick math in his head. Average transaction of, say, $6, multiplied by a few hundred customers per day, multiplied by 100 stores, 1,000 stores, 10,000 stores. He saw instantly that this was not a video rental business. This was a cash flow machine that happened to rent videos as its mechanism. The late fees alone, those beautiful, invisible, pure profit late fees, were a revenue stream that waste management could only dream of. Garbage didn't charge you extra if you forgot to take it out. In February 1987, Huizenga and his investors, including John Melk, a former waste management executive, acquired a controlling interest in Blockbuster for $18.5 million. David Cook retained a minority stake and stayed on for a time, but the power had shifted. This was now Huizenga's show, and Huizenga wasted no time. He immediately applied the waste management playbook to video rental. He began an acquisition spree that was astonishing in both speed and scope. Blockbuster bought up regional chains, Major Video, Movies to Go, Video Superstore, and converted them to the Blockbuster format. But Huizenga's real innovation was franchising. He understood that the key to dominating a market before competitors could get a foothold was to saturate it with locations. A franchisee paid Blockbuster a fee, typically around $250,000 in upfront costs plus ongoing royalties, and in return got the Blockbuster name, the inventory management system, the national advertising, and the supply chain relationships with the major movie studios. It was a machine that funded it. By 1989, more than 1,000. The company was opening a new store somewhere in America every 24 hours, and sometimes faster than that. The growth numbers were surreal. Revenue went from $43 million in 1987 to $283 million in 1989 to $630 million in 1990. The company went public in 1986 at a split-adjusted price that would make early investors extremely wealthy, but the real explosion in value happened under Huizenga's leadership as Wall Street began to understand what he was building. Huizenga also negotiated a revolutionary deal with the major movie studios, a deal that would fundamentally reshape the economics of home video. Under the traditional model, which had prevailed since the dawn of the VCR era, video stores had to buy VHS tapes outright at wholesale prices of around $65 to $100 per tape. This meant that stocking a new release like First Batman or Home Alone required enormous upfront investment. A store might need to spend $10,000 just to stock 100 copies of a single title, gambling that the rentals would generate enough revenue to cover the cost. Most stores couldn't afford that gamble, so they stocked 10 or 20 copies. Customers were disappointed, and the entire industry operated below its potential. Huizenga, drawing on an idea that had been pioneered in a limited way by a few independent chains, proposed something radically different: revenue sharing. Instead of paying $65 per tape up front, Blockbuster would pay the studio around $8 per tape, essentially covering the manufacturing cost, and then share a percentage of each rental revenue, typically 40 to 60%, with the studio over the life of the tape. This meant Blockbuster could stock 100 copies of a hit movie instead of 10, ensuring that when a customer walked in on a Friday night, the movie they wanted was actually on the shelf. The guaranteed to be there promise, Blockbuster's famous marketing slogan, was not empty advertising copy. It was an operational capability made possible by a financial structure that nobody else in the industry could match. The studios were initially skeptical. They were giving up guaranteed wholesale revenue for a promise of future rental income. But the math was compelling. More copies in stores meant more rentals, and more rentals meant more revenue-sharing dollars flowing back to the studios over time. Once the studios saw the numbers from the first few deals, they were convinced, and the model spread. By 1993, Blockbuster had more than 400 stores, revenue exceeding $2 billion, and a market capitalization that made it one of the most valuable retail brands in America. The company had become so dominant that it could dictate terms to Hollywood. Studios would sometimes delay the VHS release of a film to accommodate Blockbuster's inventory needs, and Blockbuster's purchasing decisions could make or break a movie's home video performance. Wayne Huizenga had done it again. He had taken a fragmented industry, rolled it up, and extracted billions in value. And then, in 1994, at the absolute peak of Blockbuster's dominance, he did something that seemed inexplicable at the time, but looks like absolute genius in retrospect. He sold the company. When Viacom acquired Blockbuster in 1994 for $8, $4 billion in a stock swap, Wayne Huizenga walked away with a personal payday estimated at over $500 million. He would go on to build AutoNation, buy the Miami Dolphins, and generally enjoy the life of a man who had perfectly timed his exit. Viacom, meanwhile, got a company that appeared to be a perpetual motion machine. Blockbuster was opening stores, renting movies, collecting late fees, $800 million in late fees annually by the mid-1990s, representing roughly 16% of total revenue, and distributing cash back to its parent company like a reliable ATM. But underneath the surface, things were getting complicated. The late fee model. Consumer surveys consistently showed that Blockbuster's late fees were the #1 complaint among video rental customers. People resented being charged $4 for returning a movie a day late. They resented the judgmental look from the teenager at the counter. They resented the whole experience, even as they kept coming back, because there was no alternative. In 1997, Viacom installed John Antioco as CEO of Blockbuster. Antioco was a seasoned retail executive who had run Circle K convenience stores and Taco Bell. He was not a technologist, but he was a competent operator who understood that Blockbuster's customer experience needed improvement. He eliminated late fees for a brief period and saw revenue drop by hundreds of millions of dollars overnight, which forced him to reintroduce them in a modified form. He experimented with DVD by mail. He watched the internet with growing unease. And then, in 2000, two men from California came to Dallas with an offer. Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph had founded Netflix in 1997, originally as a DVD by mail rental service, after Hastings allegedly racked up a $40 late fee on a VHS copy of Apollo 13. A story that Hastings has since admitted was largely invented for PR purposes, but which perfectly captured the consumer frustration with Blockbuster's business model. By 2000, Netflix had about 300,000 subscribers, was burning through cash at an alarming rate, and was nowhere near profitable. Hastings and Randolph knew they needed capital or a buyer. They flew to Dallas and offered to sell Netflix to Blockbuster for $50 million. $50 million. To put that number in perspective, Blockbuster had spent $60 million on a single advertising campaign in 1999. $50 million was roughly what Blockbuster collected in late fees every 3 weeks. John Antioco listened to the pitch, looked at the numbers, and said no. The official reason, as later recounted by Antioco and others in the room, was that he did not believe the DVD by mail model was a real business. Netflix's subscriber base was tiny. The company was losing money. The logistics of mailing DVDs, the postage, the damaged discs, the 2-day wait, seemed like an inferior experience compared to walking into a store and walking out with a movie 5 minutes later. Antioco reportedly laughed at the offer. Hastings and Randolph flew back to California and raised venture capital instead. But here is where the story gets more complicated and more instructive than the standard narrative of Blockbuster was dumb and Netflix was smart. John Antioco was wrong about Netflix in 2000, but he was not wrong for long. By 2004, he had recognized the existential threat. He launched Blockbuster Online, a DVD by mail service that directly competed with Netflix. He eliminated late fees entirely in 2004, sacrificing hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue, an extraordinarily painful decision for a publicly traded company whose investors had grown accustomed to that revenue. He invested heavily in the online platform, building a hybrid model where customers could return DVDs by mail or swap them in stores. By 2006, Blockbuster had launched Total Access, a program that allowed online subscribers to return DVDs to any Blockbuster store and get a free in-store rental immediately. It was, by most accounts, a superior product to Netflix. Blockbuster Online grew to 3 million subscribers. Netflix's growth stalled. Reed Hastings later admitted, in internal communications that became public, that Total Access was kicking our ass. Antioco had seen the future and was steering the ship toward it, at great cost and against fierce internal resistance. The problem was Carl Icahn. In 2005, the billionaire activist investor Carl Icahn had acquired a significant stake in Blockbuster and launched a proxy fight to gain seats on the board of Deere. Icahn was a master of the corporate raid, famous for taking large positions in undervalued companies and then aggressively pushing management to cut costs, sell assets, and return cash to shareholders. He looked at Blockbuster and saw a company wasting money on an unprofitable online venture while its core retail business was declining. He demanded that Antioco cut spending on Blockbuster Online, reinstate late fees, and focus on maximizing short-term profits. Antioco resisted, arguing that the online business was the company's only viable future. The battle consumed the company for 2 years. Board meetings became war zones. In 2007, Antioco was forced out, walking away with a severance package valued at roughly $13.7 million, a golden parachute for a man who had tried to save the company and been prevented from doing so. Carl Icahn won the board fight. The board installed a new CEO, James Keyes, formerly the CEO of 7-Eleven. Keyes had no experience in entertainment, technology, or subscription businesses. His expertise was in running convenience stores. And his first major strategic announcement, delivered in an earnings call shortly after taking over, was that he intended to return Blockbuster to its core business of in-store video rental. He explicitly stated that he did not believe the internet would materially affect Blockbuster's business model. Total Access, the program that had been kicking Netflix's ass, was effectively allowed to wither. The company had just made the single most expensive strategic error in the history of modern retail, spending 2 years fighting over the steering wheel, only to turn the car directly toward the cliff. The years between 2007 and 2010 at Blockbuster were not a slow decline. They were a free fall, the kind that happens when a company's entire business model evaporates beneath it and the people in charge do not believe in gravity. James Keyes, the new CEO, had made his philosophy clear in his very first earnings call and in interviews throughout late 2007. People like going to stores, people like the physical experience of browsing, people like talking to clerks who might recommend a movie. He said, and this is a direct quote from an investor conference in 2008, "I don't think the internet is going to materially affect our business." He said this in 2008, a full year after Netflix had launched its streaming service, after YouTube was doing billions of views per month, after Apple had launched video rentals on iTunes, and after broadband internet had crossed the threshold into a majority of American homes. This was not merely wrong. It was wrong in a way that suggested a fundamental failure to understand the technology that was reshaping the entire media landscape. This was not entirely wrong. There are indeed people who enjoy all of those things, and some of them still go to the Blockbuster in Bend, Oregon. But it was catastrophically wrong as a basis for running a company with 6,000 stores across 14 countries, billions in debt, and a competitor that was mailing DVDs for a flat monthly fee and was about to pivot to streaming. While Keyes was extolling the virtues of the in-store experience, Netflix was striking the deals that would define the next decade of entertainment. In 2008, Netflix announced a partnership with Microsoft to bring its streaming app directly to the Xbox 360, putting Netflix in millions of living rooms with no disc, no envelope, and no trip to the store required. In 2009, it expanded to the PlayStation 3 and the Nintendo Wii, covering all 3 major gaming consoles. By early 2010, Netflix streaming was available on more than 200 different devices: smart TVs, Blu-ray players, Roku boxes, TiVo DVRs, iPads, and iPhones. And the company had grown to 20 million subscribers, more than double what it had when Keyes took over at Blockbuster. This was not a gradual shift. This was an extinction event happening in real time, and Blockbuster's response was to double down on the very things that were becoming obsolete. Keyes did have a strategy, or at least something he called a strategy. He wanted to transform Blockbuster into a multi-channel entertainment destination, a company that would rent movies in stores, rent them online through a DVD by mail service, sell them through vending kiosks, sell digital downloads, and eventually stream content directly to consumers. It was, on paper, a perfectly reasonable vision, the kind of omni-channel strategy that consultants at McKinsey would charge millions of dollars to put into a PowerPoint deck. The problem was execution, timing, and money, none of which Blockbuster had in sufficient quantities. The vending kiosk initiative, branded Blockbuster Express, was a direct response to Redbox, which had exploded from a handful of test kiosks in McDonald's restaurants in 2002 to more than 22,000 bright red machines by 2009, renting DVDs for $1 a night with no membership, no late fees, and no human interaction required. Blockbuster licensed its name to NCR Corporation to deploy kiosks, but by the time the first Blockbuster-branded machines appeared, Redbox had already locked up the best locations, grocery stores, pharmacies, and big box retailers, and had built relationships with the major studios. Blockbuster was fighting a war on too many fronts: stores versus streaming, kiosks versus Redbox, online versus Netflix, and its own balance sheet versus reality. By early 2010, the situation was terminal. Blockbuster had lost more than $500 million in 2009 alone. Same-store sales were declining at double-digit rates. The company's ability to stock new releases was compromised because the major studios, watching Blockbuster's credit rating deteriorate, had begun demanding cash up front for new titles, a reversal of the revenue-sharing deals that had once been the company's competitive advantage. In March 2010, Blockbuster warned investors that it might not survive the year. The stock, which had traded above $15 as recently as 2005, fell below 30 cents. Vendors began refusing to ship products without prepayment. Landlords began filing eviction notices. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. On September 23, 2010, Blockbuster Inc. filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the Southern District of New York. The filing listed assets of $1, owed $2 billion against debts of $1, $46 billion. The largest unsecured creditors included the major movie studios. Warner Home Video owed $46 million. 20th Century Fox owed $37 million. Sony Pictures owed $28 million. The company that had once been the studio's most important customer, the gatekeeper between Hollywood and the American living room, could not pay its bills. The bankruptcy was a supervised liquidation. Blockbuster would use Chapter 11 to close hundreds more stores, renegotiate leases, and attempt to find a buyer for what remained. The employees, the 25,000 people still working for the company, the store managers who had built careers at Blockbuster, the teenagers working their first jobs, received notices that their stores might close and their hours might be cut, all while the executives who had driven the company into the ground continued to collect their salaries. The bankruptcy auction of Blockbuster Inc. took place on April 6, 2011, at the Manhattan offices of the law firm Weil, Gotshal & Manges, the same firm that had represented Lehman Brothers in its 2008 collapse, an almost poetic connection between two of the largest corporate failures in American history. By this point, Blockbuster was a shadow of itself. The company had closed more than 1,000 stores during the bankruptcy process, had laid off tens of thousands of employees, and was generating AF. The only question was who, if anyone, would buy the remaining pieces. Roughly 700 stores, the brand name, the customer database, the website, and the intellectual property, and what they would possibly do with them. Several bidders expressed interest. Carl Icahn, the man whose proxy fight had helped push the company toward bankruptcy, was reportedly part of one consortium. Various private equity firms circled, attracted by the possibility of extracting some remaining value from the brand and the real estate leases. But the winner, with a final bid of $320 million, about what Blockbuster had once spent on a single year's worth of television advertising, was Dish Network Corporation, the satellite television company founded by Charlie Ergen. Ergen was a respected but deeply enigmatic figure in the media industry, a former professional poker player and accountant who had built a multi-billion-dollar fortune by bringing satellite TV to rural America, often through aggressive spectrum acquisitions and hard-nosed negotiations that made even the most hardened cable executives flinch. His interest in Blockbuster puzzled many observers and sent Dish's stock down on the day of the announcement. Why would a satellite TV company want a dying video rental chain? Ergen's reasoning, as he later explained in investor calls and interviews, was strategic if unconventional. Dish was engaged in a brutal competitive war against cable companies that were bundling internet, television, and phone service into triple-play packages. Cable had a natural advantage. They owned the broadband pipes. Ergen wanted to offer something different, a bundle that included access to Blockbuster's library of movie content, both physical and digital, as a differentiator. He envisioned Dish customers being able to stream Blockbuster movies through their Hopper set-top boxes, rent DVDs from remaining stores, exchange online rentals at kiosks, and get exclusive content that cable subscribers could not access. It was, like so many Blockbuster strategies before it, a reasonable idea that came far too late. The Dish acquisition closed on April 26, 2011. Almost immediately, the reality of the situation became clear. The Blockbuster stores Dish had acquired were in worse shape than expected. Many were in locations where foot traffic had declined drastically. The brand, once among the most recognized in America, was now associated with obsolescence and failure. Dish attempted to keep several hundred stores open, rebranding them with a new look and offering Dish Network promotions alongside movie rentals. It also launched Blockbuster Movie Pass, a streaming service bundled with Dish subscriptions, and Blockbuster at Home, a DVD by mail service intended to compete with Netflix's disc business. None of it worked at scale. The streaming market had moved on. Netflix had 23 million streaming subscribers by the end of 2011 and was producing original content. House of Cards would debut in 2013, fundamentally changing the competitive landscape. Amazon had entered streaming with Prime Instant Video. Hulu was growing. The window for a Blockbuster-branded streaming service had closed years earlier, and Dish did not have the content library, the technology platform, or the brand credibility to pry it open again. Between 2011 and 2013, Dish gradually closed most of the remaining Blockbuster stores. Some were converted into Dish retail locations. Most were simply shuttered, the blue carpet ripped up, the shelves sold at auction, the buildings returning to the strip mall ecosystem as nail salons, dollar stores, and mattress firm locations. By November 2013, Dish announced that it would close all company-owned Blockbuster stores in the United States. The brand would live on only as a streaming service and a DVD by mail operation, both of which were losing subscribers rapidly. By early 2001, the Blockbuster brand, which Dish still technically owns to this day, became a ghost, a name that occasionally surfaces in licensing deals, nostalgia marketing campaigns, or news stories about the last remaining store. An attempt was made to license it, including a 2022 deal where it was offered to all for free, but by then the ship had sailed. But there was one exception. A single, independently owned franchise location in Bend, Oregon, had refused to close. The Bend Blockbuster, owned and operated by Sandy Harding and her family, had been a franchise since 2000. It was not part of the Dish acquisition. It was not subject to the corporate closure orders. It simply stayed open. And as every other Blockbuster in America disappeared, as the thousands of stores were liquidated and the brand became a memory, the Bend location became something unexpected, a tourist destination. People began driving hours, sometimes flying across the country, to visit the last Blockbuster on Earth. They wanted to walk the blue-carpeted aisles one more time. They wanted to smell the combination of plastic DVD cases and stale popcorn. They wanted to rent a movie, return it the next day, and pay a late fee, the very things that had made Blockbuster loathed in its prime. The late fees, the inconvenience, the trip to the store had become, in its absence, objects of genuine nostalgia. The Bend Blockbuster was not a viable business model. It was a living museum. And it was, in a strange way, the most honest version of what Blockbuster had actually been all along. Not a technology company, not a logistics company, not a streaming pioneer, but a place where people went on Friday nights to figure out what they wanted to watch. The collapse of Blockbuster has been reduced, in the popular imagination, to a single cause. Netflix killed Blockbuster. It is a satisfying story. It has heroes and villains, a clear before and after, and the elegant symmetry of the $50 million offer that was refused. But, like most stories that fit neatly into a headline, it is incomplete to the point of being misleading. The truth is that Blockbuster was killed by multiple forces acting in concert, some external, some internal, some that had been building for years before Reed Hastings ever mailed his first DVD. To understand what really happened, you have to look past the Netflix narrative and examine the structural, financial, and cultural factors that made the company so vulnerable in the first place. The first cause of death, and perhaps the most fundamental, was the late fee addiction. At its peak, Blockbuster was generating between $700 million and $800 million per year from late fees alone. For context, Netflix's total revenue in 2004, the year Blockbuster finally eliminated late fees, was just over $500 million. Blockbuster's late fee revenue was larger than Netflix's entire business. This revenue was essentially pure profit. There was no inventory cost associated with a late fee, no additional shipping, no content licensing expense. It was money that simply appeared on the balance sheet because someone forgot to return the wedding planner on time. The problem was that this revenue was also toxic. Customers hated late fees. They hated them more than almost any other consumer experience in America. When Netflix launched with a simple value proposition, pay one flat monthly fee, keep the movies as long as you want, no late fees ever, it wasn't competing on selection or convenience. It was competing directly on the one thing Blockbuster could not afford to give up. Antioco understood this, which is why he eliminated late fees in 2004. But that decision cost the company roughly $400 million in annual revenue, angered Wall Street, and gave Carl Icahn the ammunition he needed to argue that management was destroying shareholder value. Blockbuster was trapped. The thing that made you cannot win a war against an enemy whose entire value proposition is, we won't do the thing your customers hate most, when the thing your customers hate most is the thing that pays your bills. The second cause of death was debt. When Viacom acquired Blockbuster in 1994, it loaded the company with an enormous amount of leverage as part of the transaction structure. Over the years, Blockbuster also engaged in substantial stock buybacks and special dividends, extracting cash and increasing its debt burden. By the time the crisis arrived, Blockbuster had roughly $1 billion in debt and limited flexibility to invest in the digital transformation it needed. Compare this to Netflix, which was equity financed and could afford to lose money for years while building its subscriber base and content library. Blockbuster had to service its debt payments while simultaneously funding a streaming platform, a DVD by mail operation, and 6,000 physical stores. The math was impossible. The third cause of death was governance failure. The proxy fight with Carl Icahn was not simply a disagreement about strategy. It was an existential battle between two competing visions of what Blockbuster should be: a cash-generating retail business that returned money to shareholders, or a technology company that would have to destroy its own profitable business model to survive. Icahn won the board fight, which meant the cash-generating retail vision won. But that vision was already obsolete. The very day that Antioco was forced out, Blockbuster lost its last real chance to compete. James Keyes was brought in not to transform the company, but to manage its decline, and manage it he did for 3 years until the cash ran out. The fourth cause of death was a physical plant. Blockbuster's 9,094 stores at its peak in 2004 were an extraordinary achievement in retail real estate, but they were also a massive liability. Each store required rent, utilities, payroll, inventory, and maintenance. As revenue per store declined, the fixed costs did not. Netflix, meanwhile, operated a handful of distribution centers and a website. Its marginal cost of serving an additional customer was negligible. Blockbuster could not close stores fast enough to match the rate of revenue decline without triggering lease defaults and severance obligations that would accelerate the financial crisis. It was a classic innovator's dilemma. The very assets that had made Blockbuster successful were the ones preventing it from adapting. The fifth cause of death was culture. Blockbuster was a retail company, staffed by retail executives, run like a retail chain. It measured success in same-store sales and foot traffic. Netflix was a technology company, staffed by software engineers, run like a Silicon Valley startup. It measured success in subscriber growth and engagement algorithms. When the two companies collided, Blockbuster tried to compete by being a better version of itself: cleaner stores, friendlier service, a website that was sort of like Netflix's but with a Blockbuster logo. Netflix competed by being something fundamentally different. This was not simply a failure of strategy, it was a failure of imagination. Blockbuster could not conceive of a world in which the trip to the video store was not the center of the movie renting experience, because the trip to the video store had been the center of the movie renting experience for 20 years, and the company's entire identity was built around optimizing that experience. The final cause of death, in a sense, was success itself. Blockbuster had been so dominant for so long, more than a decade of unchallenged market leadership, that it had developed a kind of institutional arrogance. The company believed it could dictate terms to the market, to the studios, to customers. When customers began choosing streaming and subscription models, Blockbuster's response was not, how can we give them a better version of what they clearly want, but how can we convince them to come back to what we already do? By the time the arrogance cracked, the market had moved on without them. The Blockbuster story, stripped of its specific details about VHS tapes and late fees and Friday night rituals, is a story that has played out hundreds of times in the history of commerce and will play out hundreds more. It is the story of what happens when a company's culture, governance, and financial structure conspire to prevent it from responding to a technological shift that everyone can see coming. And it contains lessons that extend far beyond the video rental industry. The first lesson is about the danger of hating your customers' experience while depending on it for revenue. Blockbuster's late fees were a uniquely transparent example of a business model built on customer pain. But the pattern is everywhere. Airlines that make their profits from baggage fees and change penalties. Banks that depend on overdraft charges from their poorest customers. Cable companies whose pricing models are so deliberately opaque that customers need a spreadsheet to understand their bills. In every case, the company becomes addicted to revenue that customers resent, and that addiction creates an opening for a competitor whose entire value proposition is, "We don't do that." When that competitor arrives, the incumbent faces an impossible choice. Eliminate the hated practice and destroy your own profitability, or keep it and watch your customers defect. There is no good answer. The only winning move is to never become dependent on customer-hostile revenue in the first place, or to transition away from it before a competitor forces your hand. The second lesson is about the innovator's dilemma as experienced not in theory but in blood. Clayton Christensen's 1997 book, The Innovator's Dilemma, described exactly what happened to Blockbuster, and it was published while Blockbuster was still at its peak. Christensen argued that successful companies often fail, not because they are poorly managed, but because they are excellently managed. They listen to their best customers, invest in their most profitable products, and avoid markets that look too small or margins that look too thin. All of that is correct business practice, until it isn't. Netflix's DVD by mail model in 2000 looked like a niche product for a tiny market. The margins were terrible. The customer experience, waiting 2 days for a movie to arrive in the mail, seemed obviously inferior to instant gratification at a store. Every rational business calculation said to ignore it. But the rational calculation failed to account for the fact that the internet would make physical delivery irrelevant, that streaming would eliminate the disc entirely, and that the inferior product would improve so rapidly that the incumbent would have no time to respond. The lesson is not always chase every new technology. Most new technologies fail. The lesson is that when a new entrant is improving at an exponential rate, when their technology is getting better and cheaper on a trajectory that will eventually intersect with your customer base, you must respond before the intersection happens, because by the time the threat is obvious to everyone, it is too late. The third lesson is about governance and the destructive potential of short-term thinking. Carl Icahn did not destroy Blockbuster out of malice. He destroyed it out of a rational commitment to maximizing shareholder value in the present tense. From his perspective, Blockbuster was a cash-generating machine that management was undermining by pouring money into unprofitable ventures. He was not wrong about the near-term financials. He was catastrophic. This is the fundamental tension of modern capitalism. The interests of shareholders who want returns this quarter are often directly opposed to the interests of the company that needs to survive the next decade. Blockbuster's board chose the shareholders over the company, and as a result, both ended up with nothing. The lesson is not that shareholders are bad or that activist investors are always wrong. It is that a board of directors must have the courage to make decisions that look terrible in the short term if they are necessary for survival in the long term, and that governance structures that prioritize quarterly earnings over strategic transformation are ultimately self-defeating. The fourth lesson is about sunk costs and the courage to cannibalize yourself. Blockbuster's 909 stores were not just assets, they were arguments. Every time someone proposed investing in digital streaming, the stores were invoked as evidence that Blockbuster was a retail company. Every time someone suggested closing locations faster, the lease obligations were invoked as evidence that closing stores was too expensive. The stores were the past, but they consumed the resources that should have been invested in the future. The lesson is that when technological change threatens your business model, you must be willing to destroy your own assets before someone else does. This is extraordinarily difficult. It means telling your franchisees that their investments are about to become worthless. It means writing off billions in real estate. It means laying off people who have done nothing wrong. But the alternative, waiting for the market to do it for you, is worse for everyone involved. Blockbuster's slow liquidation over 4 years was far more painful, for far more people, than a rapid transformation would have been. The fifth and perhaps most profound lesson is about identity. Blockbuster did not fail because it lacked smart people, good ideas, or sufficient capital. It failed because it could not answer the most fundamental question a company can face. What business are we actually in? Was Blockbuster in the video rental business, or was it in the entertainment access business? If it was in the video rental business, then the stores, the tapes, and the late fees were the product. If it was in the entertainment access business, then the stores, the tapes, And the late fees were just one delivery mechanism among many. And when better delivery mechanisms emerged, the company should have embraced them even at the cost of its existing operations. Blockbuster never resolved this question. It defined itself by its physical presence, by the blue carpet and the candy racks and the Friday night ritual. When the ritual changed, the company could not change with it. The lesson for every business, in every industry, is to define yourself by the problem you solve for customers, not by the method you use to solve it. The method will change. The problem, access to great entertainment, in Blockbuster's case, will not. In the end, everything we have described, the billions in market value erased, the 84,000 jobs lost, the 9,000 stores shuttered, the 25-year arc from startup to bankruptcy to afterlife, comes down to a single store in a strip mall in Bend, Oregon. The Bend Blockbuster is not a franchise in the traditional sense anymore. It is something closer to a pilgrimage site. Visitors come from all over the world. They buy merchandise, Blockbuster-branded hoodies, shot glasses, keychains, even the iconic membership cards. They take selfies under the blue and yellow sign. They rent movies they could stream in 30 seconds on their phones. And in doing so, they are not really renting movies. They are renting the past. They are paying for the experience of walking into a video store on a Friday night in 1998, even if it's a Tuesday afternoon in 2025. They are paying for the memory of something that was, for a generation, the defining ritual of leisure in America. The nostalgia for Blockbuster is, in many ways, more interesting than the company ever was. People do not feel this way about Circuit City, or Borders, or Toys R Us, other retail giants that fell to changing technology. They feel sad about those companies, but they do not feel sentimental. Blockbuster is different. Blockbuster was part of people's lives in a way that a television retailer or a bookstore chain could not be. It was where you went on your first date. It was where your dad let you pick the movie for family night. It was where you argued with your siblings about whether to rent Jurassic Park or Clueless. It was where you learned that the movie you wanted was already rented and had to settle for something else. And sometimes that something else became your favorite movie. The experience was not just transactional, it was social. And that is why, even as we acknowledge that streaming is faster, cheaper, and infinitely more convenient, there is a part of us that misses the inconvenience. The friction that Blockbuster introduced into the process, the drive to the store, the browsing, the disappointment when the new release was gone, the negotiation with whoever you were watching with, the late fee at the end, was not just friction. It was ritual. It made watching a movie feel like an event rather than just another option in an infinite scroll. But nostalgia is not a business model. The Bend Blockbuster survives because it is the last of its kind, a living fossil that people want to see before it disappears. It does not survive because the video rental model is viable in 2025. If someone tried to open a new chain of video rental stores today, it would fail within months. The world has moved on. The real ending of the Blockbuster story is not a single store in Oregon. It is something both more unsettling and more universal. Every business that exists today is potentially the Blockbuster of tomorrow. The forces that destroyed Blockbuster, technological substitution, changing consumer behavior, the innovator's dilemma, short-term financial pressures, the inability to answer the question, what business are we in, are not unique to video rental. They are operating in every industry right now. Artificial intelligence is coming for knowledge work the way streaming came for retail. Autonomous vehicles are coming for transportation the way Netflix came for Blockbuster. The companies that dominate today, the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts, will face their own Netflix moments, their own innovators' dilemmas, their own Carl Icahns demanding short-term profits at the expense of long-term survival. And the question is not whether they will face these moments, it is whether they will handle them any better than Blockbuster did. The ghost of Blockbuster does not haunt the video rental industry, which no longer exists. It haunts every boardroom, every executive suite, every venture capital pitch deck. It whispers a simple question. What are you addicted to that your customers hate? What tiny competitor are you ignoring because their margins look too thin? What would it cost you to cannibalize your own business before someone else does it for you? The last VHS tape Blockbuster ever rented was reportedly a copy of Alexander, the Oliver Stone historical epic starring Colin Farrell, which had been sitting on the shelf in a Hawaii store for years, unrented, until someone finally took it home in 2012. There is something almost poetic about this, a movie about a conqueror who built an empire that collapsed immediately after his death, rented on a dead format from a dead company, in the final days before the format and the company were buried together in the same cultural grave. The name Blockbuster itself came from the film industry term for a massively successful movie, the kind of movie that would have people lining up around the block to buy tickets. David Cook chose the name because he wanted his stores to be associated with hits, with success, with the biggest and best that Hollywood had to offer. He could not have known that the name would become synonymous with the opposite, the spectacular failure, the cautionary tale, the blockbuster that bombed. But perhaps that is fitting. The story of Blockbuster is, in its own strange way, a blockbuster in the truest sense. It has everything: a visionary founder, a ruthless consolidator, a dramatic peak, a tragic flaw, those beautiful, terrible late fees, a cast of characters that includes Hollywood studios, Wall Street raiders, and Silicon Valley disruptors, a climax in a bankruptcy courtroom, and a bittersweet epilogue in a strip mall in Central Oregon. It is the kind of story that Blockbuster itself might have stocked on its shelves in the drama section, somewhere between Asterisk the Social Network and Too Big to Fail. And, like any great movie, it stays with you after the credits roll, asking questions you cannot quite answer, leaving you with the uncomfortable feeling that you have just watched something important and that you might be living